Okay, so this is just a short video for anyone that's studying the Tudors, and particularly anyone that's studying the two Henrys, Henry VII and Henry VIII, father and son. And I just wanted to talk a little bit today about the year 1509, when Henry comes to power, when he is crowned King of England, and the differences in approach that Henry VIII and Henry VII have. Both men come from very different backgrounds. Henry VII was spent most of his life in either Wales, where he grew up, or in exile in Brittany, where his uncle Jasper Tudor took him in order to keep him safe from Edward IV. He was an exile. He lived in relative poverty, poverty for a noble. He had a very small entourage, so he has very few friends, advisors, fellow nobles, the kinds of people that the nobility keep around them. So his retinue, it is referred to. And he has little experience when he comes to the throne. He has quite a lot of knowledge about diplomacy and how to play off one's enemies. That's kind of how he's survived for so long. But he is certainly, when he comes to power, he has no money. And the thing about rulership in the late 15th and early 16th centuries is that a broke king doesn't last very long. That rulership is based on the crown being able to have a monopoly on monies, on income. It's less about the ability to deploy military force, because if you have a large income, then you can buy all the military force you need. Europe is full of mercenaries, and you can ship them in and pay for them, and that's no problem. In the second half of the Wars of the Roses, the nobles have eclipsed the power of the throne. They become more powerful collectively than the throne because they have more land than the crown, and they have more wealth than the crown, and they can afford to pay their hirelings and henchmen, known as retainers, and hold on and have their own private armies. The king, who has not got a standing army, Henry VI or Edward IV, would need to go, if they wanted to wage war in France, say, to go cap in hand to the nobles and ask them for the use of their troops. And this means that the crown is always weaker than the nobles. What you have is a term referred to as over-mighty nobles. Now, the over-mighty nobles, when they know that the crown is weak, they feud between themselves about who should replace the crown or who should defend the crown. And this gives 3 decades of instability, the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII's task was to try to make sure that these wars eventually came to an end. He had various talks with the rival family, the Yorkists, while he was in exile in 1483, about marrying the two houses, York and Lancaster, together, and he would eventually do this by marrying Elizabeth of York. And he was determined to make sure that the nobles were brought to heel. He realised that this was the only way to actually end the Wars of the Roses and to secure a dynasty. So you can see the worries and anxieties that Henry VII has when he comes to the throne. And he endures many years of rebellions, uprisings, and pretender plots against him. And during this period of time, it's unsurprising that he's extremely careful with the crown's revenues. He makes sure that more money is coming in than is going out. He is joked about at the time as being almost like a miserly sort of figure, somebody who won't spend money at all. That's not quite true. He made sure that he and his royal court had quite a nice standard of living, and he certainly liked to spend money on himself. But what he did was make sure that the accounts of the royal courts were carefully monitored. He made sure that he signed off each page of accounts every single day. And so he knew that more money was coming in to the crown's coffers than going out. He made sure that the nobles were reduced in wealth and status. He used bonds and recognisances, fines and confiscated land, partly because he crowned himself the day before the Battle of Bosworth. Therefore, any Yorkists that fought for Richard III were deemed traitors, and the way they got themselves back into the royal good books was by obeying Henry's new financially punitive laws. There are surprisingly few punishments of a violent nature, partly because Henry doesn't wish to prolong the Wars of the Roses by risking a revolt. And so he tries to go about things in as non-bloodthirsty a manner as possible. Perhaps it's not really in his nature as well. So on to Henry VIII. Henry VIII obviously grows up in very different circumstances. Henry VIII was the second surviving son of Henry VII. His older brother Arthur died in adolescence in 1503 of the sweating sickness. Arthur was meant to have married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the new superpower in Europe since the fusion of Granada, Aragon and Castile into one nation state. And the problem that Henry VII experiences is once one son dies, there is a marriage clause that says that the second son will now marry Catherine of Aragon. Henry is 11 at the time, but he does finally in 1509 marry her. When he comes to the throne, she's a lot older than him, and he does this partly because I think he does actually have some affection for her, but also to present himself as a unifying figure for the nation. Henry VII had kept Catherine of Aragon in England almost a virtual hostage. She was unable to go home, and there was a widespread popular sympathy for her across England. People thought that she was treated very unfairly, and that she would now be unable to have a child because she could not find herself a husband. So Henry marries her, and they do have a child. They have a daughter, Mary, who would go on to be Mary I. The difference between Henry VIII and Henry VII is that they have a different attitude towards money and spending. Henry VIII is a Renaissance king. He is a new kind of king, really, that exists in the 16th century, that believes that he must have a new relationship with the people that he rules over. The 16th century is a time of new ideas. It's a time of rising literacy and a time of increased access to knowledge. There is a growing publishing industry across Europe. I call it an industry, but a growing publishing trade anyway. The ability to print books and also print them not in Latin anymore, but in English or French or German or what have you, is changing the way people, and particularly influential and important people, think about things. And new ideas about the role of the king are developing. And Henry believes that the king must appear kingly, that the king must appear grand and impressive and powerful and important at all times and in all ways, and that in order to do this, a king must have several things. A king must have finery. A king must engage on royal processions, royal progresses around the country, and the king must also wage war. Now let's look at those three things in turn. Finery is quite obvious. It is about what the king and his retinue and his royal court wear. King Henry VIII is a far more splendid and grand ruler than Henry VII. His public appearance is very, very different. He wears silks and furs and jewels and all manner of baubles and that kind of thing. And he also employs very famous painters, people such as the Dutch master painter Hans Holbein, to paint his portraits, so people who enter royal palaces can see these huge images of Henry. And these things are very expensive. They're not quite as expensive as Henry's taste for stately homes and castles. Henry has a huge list of properties that he owns and has developed, and castles he has renovated and rebuilt and changed. Henry also goes on royal progresses, where the royal court would leave London and travel to certain parts of England so that the people could see the king and the people could see how grand and majestic the king is. And he believed that this was what the people wanted, and quite possibly he was right. But he also believed that what the people wanted was a warrior king, a king who could bring them victory. The extent to which ordinary Tudor peasants and farmers and yeomen and townspeople actually wanted these things is doubtful. People generally tend to want improving living conditions and that sort of thing. But it was a belief that war was seen as the sport of kings. To wage war was a kingly pursuit. Now, one of the reasons why it's possible to think this in the 16th century is war in the 16th century is very unlike war in the 20th century. In the 20th century, we have fought wars of annihilation, where genocide and wiping the enemy completely off the map, bombing cities and razing in entire countries to the ground, has been the way that war is being fought. In the 16th century, war was a far more limited affair, certainly kind of horrifically bloody on the battlefield, and when besieging a town, all sorts of terrible things might occur. But war was the risks of national destruction when it came to war were far, far reduced. Anyway, the advisors to Henry VIII in 1509 had been inherited from Henry VII. And Henry VII's advisors advised Henry to continue with really everything that his father had been doing. They said, make sure you're very sensible with money, very careful with money, try not to do anything too outlandish or ridiculous or risky. And Henry promptly dismisses all of them. He even has Empson and Dudley from the council learned in the law flung in jail. And later the pair of them are executed. Partly this was because Henry knew how unpopular they were. And this is another thing, another difference between Henry VIII and Henry VII. Henry VIII believes in the value of popularity. He craves it. If Henry VII's power was built on reducing the power of the nobles, Henry VIII's power is built, he believed, on a strong relationship with the nation, and that meant not just the commons, the ordinary common people, but the nobility as well. And therefore, doing things that seem popular is part of Henry's modus operandi. For example, marrying Catherine of Aragon in 1509, having Empson and Dudley flung in jail, and Henry is very keen to project this image of himself as both glorious and great, but also a popular figure. Now, that tells us something interesting. It tells us that the way in which monarchs believed that they should act, and the way in which they believed they could build support, and the way in which they interacted with ordinary people had started to change. And this is because the society of Tudor England was starting to change. Now, I don't want to go down that track just now, but I will talk about Tudor society a little bit more in a forthcoming video. So anyway, I hope you found this useful. Please do subscribe to this channel, and I'll be putting out some more things on the Tudors later this week or early next week. Anyway, thank you very much. Bye bye.